I am this morning with the fabulous Heather Carlucci, psychic medium and medical intuitive.
That's me.
And I know both of your incredible skills. I've had readings with you for both. And I think today we're going to talk about trends in readings, sort of
Mhm.
what you've been seeing in readings that speak to trends in society, things that are people going through. Where do you want to start?
I was thinking maybe let's start with when you individually, as a reader, see a trend in your clients. Like, is it a type of client or is it random bunch of clients and then you see a trend in issue or a trend in something you need to, like that kind of thing, which I often take as a sign for myself. I'll give you a little bit of an example. And I may have brought this up to you before in one of our other conversations because it's always a good example of this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Before lockdown, I had this like weekly gig at this spa out in Denville, New Jersey.
Oh,
And
wow.
it was opened by two sisters. They built it from one storefront to the entire building. And the amazing thing is that ever since they opened like 16 years ago or something like that, they always had a full rostered schedule of psychics and mediums that would come in. And they were very vetted. And some people would come in from, like all over the globe. And it's really a cool place. Anyway, I would go there every Monday. And I remember at one point I worked there a few days in one week and I kept getting a very specific person. And it was a male, which was surprising because it was in the middle of very suburban New Jersey. And I think let's maybe like 7 to 8 out of 10 people come to psychics. They're usually women. They were male, straight, cisgendered, and all in their 50s and 60s. And I was like, oh my God, it ended up being like 12 in a row. It was a lot. And
Interesting.
every single one of them was painfully blocked.
Hmm.
Like, I was like, why? I kept asking, like, why did you come here? Why me of all, like, why? Well, either my wife or my sister, my mother made me because nobody
Mhm.
can stand me anymore. And I can't handle being in my own head. Or I didn't know what else to do. No one else knows I'm here.
Right.
And that was the really, and to me, I realized I was like, oh, the first day I went home, and because before I left I used to never ask who was coming the next day, and I was like, that was all men. How's the next day looking? And the woman in the front desk was like, again, all men. It's a spa, so they knew what to expect of their clientele. She's
Right.
like, that's kind of weird. And I see it the day after as well, and I was like, this is really strange. And then when I was in bed that night, I remember thinking, what the hell is this? And I was like, you know what, I have to release my hesitation or prejudice
Mm.
of men of a certain age. They were also all very privileged. I was like, I have to like show compassion
Right.
to all. Is this something
Hmm.
I have to work on?
Right.
Otherwise there's no way you can help. You can't read anybody clearly if you don't. First thing I
Right.
teach. And also like you have to find the compassion no matter what.
Right. So both the trend there, but also for you, it's showing up of forcing you to sort of note where this was a place where like, you know what, for this clientele, I'm having to work a little bit harder for the compassion.
That's something I had to work at. But also, like, if I see that in medical readings, if I keep getting in and it's like, let's say, like, I don't know, intestinal issues over and over and over again, I check myself.
Right.
Like, how are my intestines? Because if I'm not paying attention to myself, I feel like the universe will come along and be like, Heather, there's a reason why we're throwing these people at you.
That is very funny. So in a way, then what you're saying, a trend, there's both the sort of social thing, right? There's like the societal thing, like the lockdown and people sort of reaching a certain point.
Right.
And then there's sort of like why they come to you. And coming to you can sometimes have to do with you. And now I'm curious, like, because you're both a psychic medium and a medical intuitive, which means that you both read people psychically, you'll talk to spirits, like you'll connect with deceased, and you're going to do medical reading, so people come to you with like medical stuff, so that like that's a really interesting gamut, opens you up to different audiences. But I'm curious, like how much do you think that that combination, or just the fact that you label yourself psychic medium kind of sets you up for certain trends versus others?
Oh, that's a really good question. I have no idea. I mean,
I
I
just thought, I was just curious, like, because so much of it is about how people kind of perceive us,
yeah,
you, like,
yeah.
should I go to this person or should I go to that person? And one of the things I know about you, and if anybody who's ever worked with you knows about you, is that you're like so funny and down to earth and like a direct kind of like, there's not this sort of, you don't start with sort of, and I don't mean this disparaging, but there's no sort of woo woo, like
No, it's
ritualistic kind of thing. You dive right in. And so I can imagine that also speaks to kind of who shows up.
it's funny because whenever somebody comes to me for something medical, they're kind of like, it's for a medical thing. I booked a medical thing, but it's okay if something else comes in. Like everybody wants the treats too, the hard stuff, but everybody wants the treats. And
Yeah.
that's totally fine because both they come through very differently.
Yeah.
But one always helps the other.
Mm.
Like if I pick something up in you and I'm like, okay, it's this thing because of this, because of this. And then they're like, and perhaps you'll say, well, what about the other pain I'm getting in my low back? Right.
Right. Right.
And
The,
I am working on it and I'm looking around and one of your people through mediumship can come through and be like, literally, like, be like, look a little bit to the left. Or you're not considering the bowel, or ask them about the fall they took last week, like that kind of thing.
fascinating.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and sometimes it comes through one of the eight clairs, which is all psychic.
Mhm.
So they help each other, though they feel very differently when I'm doing the reading. They read different, they're from different, almost not worlds but kind of planets.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm sure interrelated. I mean, if you're talking about somebody who's sort of like dealing with, some sort of life challenge, a relationship decision, a job decision, they're like
It will
questioning
come
who
up.
they are. And then they've got all this other stuff that's sort of showing up physically. I'm sure some of your stuff is like, oh, this is what's going on a physical level. Like,
Oh,
and like
absolutely.
you need to, and maybe you need to change your diet, you need to see somebody, you need to do X, but also here's why this is also showing up in your
Oh
like
my God, it's your
spiritual life,
dad.
right? Right.
Like the dad issues cannot hold and contain themselves anymore.
Yeah,
Fabric of your body. It is all coming out in your hip. That's why you're having the hip issue.
that's
Oh,
right.
yeah, for sure. I mean, like I'll be very medical, and me when I read medically, like I don't read chakras or energy. It's literally,
Right.
it sounds very medical.
It's
Uh,
very, yeah.
but then, on the way out, I'll be like, by the way, the thing with your dad when you were 12 years old that you never got over, like time to let it
It's,
go, or like
yeah,
figure
work
out
on
how
it.
to talk to him about it, or yeah. And that's where that's always sort of interestingly enough, sort of a gotcha moment. Because then we're like, because when you
Yeah.
start, so much of what happens with physical work, because it comes in layers, right? For medical,
Hmm.
there's what the person is feeling. There's what's actually, right. That's one thing. And then the other thing is like what's actually happening in the body,
Hmm.
what else that affects that you don't realize it, because that's
Right.
another thing. And then there's the medical stuff, like the technical, like it gets to getting
Right.
issue, like, oh, are you already on prescriptions? What you might want to ask your doctor about. Or sometimes it's like you're seeing the wrong doctor. And we'll be like,
Mm,
I'm like, I don't like this guy. Go see this other person. They're waiting for you spiritually.
right.
Or you're seeing an endocrinologist, you should be seeing a blah, 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 right? Which is always interesting as well, because I'm like, don't let the endocrinologist go yet, but find out why I keep seeing this, because it's so clear it's not a bad idea,
Right.
And it could be as little as like, oh, I don't really have that on my plan, but my brother-in-law is a blah, blah, blah. And that person goes to ask him and he gives them some information that's really important. So,
Right.
the spirits work in interesting ways. But the last thing of the physical part of the reading is realizing sometimes what age the weakness of the body started. Now,
Mhm.
I will say that with the statement that I do not believe all physical ailments come from past trauma. I do not fall into that group at all, because we live in a world of a million things, of pollutants and poisons and just genetic glitches and and epigenetics, and there's a million things that we just didn't know about. I'm never in a million years going to say like, oh my God, cancer is your fault. I mean, that's got to be the most ludicrous BS.
Right. Yeah.
But it's always interesting. And then always when you sort of bring up the age at which something could have possibly started, that's always a big sort of like, I call it like the crack in the clouds where like the light comes in, because people go, oh, and it's funny because we have such a detached way of looking at things, especially depending on who raises us. Because sometimes like, what went on when you were 7? And they were like, not a lot. And like, what happened when you were 7? Like, the only thing I can think of is where we were displaced because we lost our home and my dad lost his job and my mom left us. But like, and I was like, and what else? And they're like, oh my God. I'm like, I know.
Right. So
we just look at things very functional,
Right. Well, you're hitting on something that I see a lot, which is that, these sort of past moments, which may not always explain the physical, but may, as you sort of suggested, kind of like have sort of started like the roots of something, right? That started a weakness in the body. But just the amount of stuff that people carry from when they were younger that's just not resolved. Like we're really just all of us walking around just unresolved. And I was curious if because I've seen two trends. One is that, people not sort of overlaying their stuff with what, well, I've healed it already. Like I've got the spiritual center, like I got the lesson out of it, it's done. And I'm like, it's not, it's still working on you. Like you think you've turned the page, and that's okay, because we've all got that. I'm curious what shows up for you, like in terms of like people dealing with unresolved stuff.
Definitely that. First and foremost, everything you just said. I also don't believe there's any such thing as I'm done or finished with that.
Right. 100%.
I say that from a very, very deep place of humility, because I've been that person.
Oh yeah.
Until you realize like, all right, I will be able to deal with this sometimes with grace, and it will feel like it's put to bed. And then something will trigger me I don't know why.
Yeah.
I think as long as like you sort of accept the lack of perfection that like existing is.
Absolutely.
Like if a bad thing happens to you, well, doesn't mean you have to relive it, but you will have to sort of be like, you know what, when this thing sort of comes to mind, Patrick, I feel like shit. And this week I'm going to feel like shit, like,
right.
Or I might bounce back fast for no reason, right? Because of a good thing happening, or I looked at it differently for the first time. But I think it's all I don't think we can get out alive on that one, because we literally get hijacked by like inner child stuff on the daily. And the people who resist it the most are always the ones who are acting out the most.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And I think that the sort of sense for people who feel like they've done a lot of work, or, are deep in their spiritual path, and they're like, oh, like I have to resolve this. Like not resolving this is like a failure. Like I'm failing somehow if I'm not like over this fully and completely.
Yeah, it's a goal. It becomes goal oriented. Now, working on it until you feel better and feel relief.
Sure.
100%. I mean, anything that gives you relief outside of like meth.
Yeah.
Got all of that.
There's a no meth zone, just in case. No meth zone here. Okay, not recommending meth. No confusion, people.
Please, no. I said no meth. I didn't say, but I think it comes through a lot. I'm like, but something comes in with like a liver issue, and they'll literally be walking through and be like, oh my God, you're right. And I'm like, yeah. And it's also hurting you like kind of in your armpit, because that whole area is like pulled down, fascia, blah, blah. And like, yeah, that's it. And I'm like, and something major happened when you were 12. I'm like, oh my God, that's it. And I was like, okay, that's sort of what's coming up. Like, no, I'm done with that. And you're like, apparently not, because I just read it like a book. Right. And God knows what you're putting your spouse through at this
right. Exactly.
Yeah. She's still not allowed to watch 101 Dalmatians, otherwise you lose your mind. What does that mean to you? Right?
Exactly.
It's random things like that, and that comes up.
And that comes up. It does. Exactly. Exactly. So I'm curious, like that, all of this was like fantastic. And within the context of the question of sort of like how these trends sort of, when you notice them, is there anything that you're noticing of late, like the 20s or the early 2020 when you, or 2021, I don't remember what the year was that you said, but early in the pandemic when these sort of men were showing up at the spa, are you seeing,
2019. It was
oh, that's
2019.
2019,
Yeah.
pre-pandemic, no, pre-pandemic.
Yeah. Well, you asked me if other things have come up
Yeah,
or
like, yeah, if you're noticing anything like either during the pandemic or recently as we're coming out of like things that you're, and they don't have to be tied to the
right.
time. It's like the ebb and flow of like who's showing up and what sort of seems to be.
I think people, I'm finding this at least in my own work, are I think the people that are coming to people like us are doing it to take part in their own issues
Mm,
more than before. I feel that, and I may be wrong, I may just have like be very lucky with my clientele, which I am by and large very lucky with my clientele, but the whole goop thing, that's
mm,
like fake spirituality, I feel like it's dissipating and people are doing this to be active. I mean, I know, and like if you come to me or I'm not going to constantly try and sell you to buy a package of something unless you're
right.
like, I want to do this twice a month for a while. I'll be like, great, buy a package, it's cheaper.
Yeah,
And then you also have the advance of being, or the advantage of me being around for you, right?
yeah,
That's sort of
exactly.
a little bit
Exactly.
more, right? But I'm not trying to pass anything off on anybody. You're not trying to pass anything off on anybody. It's like, what makes this easier? And I think for a lot of people, there has been who might have chased that earlier,
Mm,
sort of need to follow a bunch of people
yeah,
or had little respect for other people's cultures you shouldn't be trampling on. Find your own. I think there is this sort of a bit of a more mature wave of people kind of coming in that are like, I want to figure how this works for me. And I,
yes,
and I want to take participation in it. It's just not like me laying it out for you, which I was never going to do anyway. Those people really dislike me because I'm like, ask some questions about your own life. And they're like, I don't
yeah,
want to do that. It's not for me.
yeah,
And I feel that way sometimes, but I do it, sitting in the middle of my bed, like, well, I don't know what to do. But I don't go following people like that. That's the impression I'm kind of getting from a lot of the people. There's much more, how can I do this for myself?
hmm,
Which I love.
yeah,
I mean, not just because I teach classes in it, but just because it's like, oh, it's kind of working. Like
right,
literally like the veil has been lifted for a lot of people and they're like,
right.
oh, I don't need to go following people,
That's right.
you know?
Yeah, I recently had a reading where somebody was like, well, maybe I should like find a guru. And I'm like, why do you think that? Why do you think that you need a guru?
Yeah.
And they were like, oh. And the kind of the very impulse to that question was bound up in the very thing that they were actually trying to release, which was about self-empowerment. I find that like you, I see a lot of this, and I very much in my readings am about like self-empowerment. Like I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm not here to tell you like the choices to make. I'm here to help you illuminate and feel connected to your own wisdom and what feels right for you so that then you go make
Yeah.
choices in the world. Like that is to me the path. And the sort of the willingness to sort of the discernment that people are bringing to like, not just absorbing everything and accepting it because somebody on YouTube or Instagram or TikTok said it, and they've got a big following already. There's this willingness to be like, is that true for me? And I think that that's really powerful.
Yeah. I mean, I think also, and this is in an extreme situation, when people are insistent on following somebody, and I'm not talking about a teacher. I think a teacher is very different than like a guru or, somebody who
Right.
you give a lot of money to for anything.
Yes.
And there is sort of a group mentality, but it allows you subconsciously to be part of bad behavior.
Mm,
You're always looking at that person as a parent
right.
who's going to hold your hand through things or guide you or somebody to look up to. And it's sort of like, you can parent yourself, of course, but the spiritual track is an iffy one. I think that's also why I've always made sure I was like, I'm not a woo-woo person in the first place.
Right.
Compared to a lot of people, I might seem that way, but I'm not. And I think when people are on it, they expect it's very Judeo-Christian type of behaviors.
Mm,
And they always, especially we're talking like, white Christian type and Catholic and churchy, and they always allow for really bad behaviors. It's in the culture, and it's sort of like, I think when you're out of that and you're dealing with your own crap,
hmm
I think when people are really ready, they're better behaved towards themselves.
Interesting. Interesting. At least the way I'm hearing it, the tendency to follow certain kinds of figures. And I think the distinction you made with the teacher is really important because I've had teachers. There are times we need teachers. Just because you're figuring it out for yourself doesn't mean you have nothing to learn and that you know it all already. I got my triggers. Somebody asked me once and they wanted to know if I still got triggered. And I was like, of course, I have my triggers. And I can tell you that I don't know of a single spiritual teacher out there who doesn't. I know of many who pretend they don't have triggers, but I've seen their triggers. And this person I could tell was like, oh, well, I'm not going to work with you because you haven't reached the level that I'm looking for. And I was like, okay, we're good.
I across the board don't believe in enlightenment. I believe you can have some enlightenment about certain things, but I don't believe in a consistent blanketed enlightenment.
Well, if we're talking a state that you achieve where you never feel any moment of triggering, you're in perfect harmony, everything, right? If your version of enlightenment is that's not attainable, and I just know that when I have it, I'm like, this is my stuff again. I'm fine with that version if we want to call that.
Yes.
Right. Like I'm with you on we reach this endpoint of perfect mastery and we're done in a human body. I ain't seen it yet. I've never met a single person on this planet.
No,
And
and I believe that the people who were like that were just people who are like now in charge.
right. Yeah, exactly. Right.
That's not, it's like every king in England was God blessed. And it's like, dude.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
It's all enough to.
And the thing that is important for people to know is that you can have that and still have incredible knowledge, wisdom, gifts, etc. I mean, a lot of the most gifted healers I know, like incredibly talented people, readers, psychics, etc., like the gamut, and they can still have those issues. And I'm fine with that, provided they're not pretending that they have transcended all of their issues. That to me is the moment where I'm like, okay, well, that's what we got to work on. We got to work on.
Expect perfection from anybody.
Yeah.
It makes me nervous is when people expect to find that in their teachers, they expect to get there themselves.
Yes.
And then the people that become the new like false gods to somebody.
And to somebody, and then eventually it erupts and it falls apart, and that's the cycle. And so when you just let go of that, and I think that if people can come away from a reading like with some insight, but also just the sense that like what they're going through is like it's okay, it's normal, it's not a failure. You're not there's stuff that we need to look at that we have our blind spots where, as you're saying, like you point out, you're like, oh, that thing that happened when you were 7, and you're like, oh yeah, I haven't really worked on that. That's not a criticism. That's not a fault. That's not like,
No,
oh,
it's just a fact.
it
It's
just
just a
is.
fact.
It just is. There it is.
Yeah, you can't get
Yeah,
rid of it. You can't get rid of it.
that's right.
Oh, the other thing that I always think is interesting when people say, I was like, do you remember what happened when you were 5? And they're like, I don't remember my childhood.
Oh, yes.
Like blown because I can remember everything good and bad. But there are people that cannot remember. And it's like, well, that's the stuff that's coming up. I would start to ask the people in your life what was going on during that time if you can't remember.
Right. There is a reason you can't remember.
Yeah, it's so you can survive,
Yeah, exactly. You can survive.
without being appalled every 2 minutes. Because there's that as well. But it's interesting. I guess this entire conversation is sort of turning into is like how much trauma comes up in a reading
All the time.
all the time. I know I don't want to scare people away from getting reading because they're not all like this. It just happens to be part of the human condition.
It does. Yeah.
That's why we can kind of be a little bit nonchalant about talking about it because it's just an existing thing.
Right. I mean, the thing that I think that has happened in a way that's really positive is that, we talk a lot, there's a lot of talk about trauma, and it's sort of like the normal human condition is actually trauma. And that's not to say that there aren't
That's
degrees,
true, yes.
right? Like there are horrific events that have PTSD where abuses that, like you've had serious defense mechanisms. And there are people that, when stuff is like that, that I'm like, I hope that you have and are continuing. And if you're not, should go work with a trauma specialist on some of these things. Like there are things that I'm like, I'm not going to process, childhood sexual abuse with somebody who I don't feel like I can. I'm not a therapist. I'm very clear on that.
Tell people that all the time. I'm like, I am not a therapist. I can recommend somebody for you. I
Right.
can pick it up and it might feel better having somebody acknowledge it
Yeah.
and acknowledge that you are better than that,
Right.
which is great. I like being the person that can be like, I'm seeing this, by the way, and you need to be gentle with yourself.
Exactly.
And please find somebody professional to talk to.
That's right. I do that all the time. I'm like, go work on this. This is what's coming up. And at the same time, like trauma with a lowercase t, so to speak, it's like the human condition is just like all of these things that it all essentially works the same way. It gets etched in our bodies. It gets etched in our minds. These emotional patterns show up. And so when people show up and they're like, I'm struggling with this, I'm struggling with that, it's like almost, usually the read points in that direction. So how do you want to wrap things up?
Where do we want to end? I don't know. Do we have to end?
Well, we don't have to. I would talk to you for hours.
I don't know. I feel that this conversation has been great for other like psychic professionals, other light workers, because I think I hope people are like, oh yeah, I get that too, or I'll look out for that. Because I think about the things I didn't know when I walked into doing this professionally, maybe like 20 some odd years ago. I remember a friend of mine saying to me, was talking about something kind of heavy in her life. And I said, are you talking to somebody? Are you seeing a therapist? And she's like, I've been working with the psychic on it. And I was like, get out of town, lady. This is major life stuff. Like, why would you go to a psychic for this? And mind you, I have always gone to see psychics because I came from that kind of family that would go to see psychics and, some really extraordinary ones in my life. But still, I would not have gone for that. I would have gone to a therapist. And I think it's great to get some things from a reading. I think it's great to maybe find out where things are sitting for you. If they're so upfront in a psychic reading, it's maybe time for you to deal with stuff. But I don't think, and it can feel therapeutic in the moment.
Yes.
But I think people have to remember this isn't actually therapy.
Right. It's a huge piece.
You can't pass off everything on a past life thing. You cannot take responsibility off of your shoulders and blame it on like curses and things like that. But like, it usually means that you can sort of stop the pain by just heading it off with somebody who is compassionate and is a professional.
That's right. That's right. I think that's so true. There is something very therapeutic, and part of that therapy or the therapeutic quality is I think people feeling seen and feeling that sense of like a sense of hope or relief of like, oh, there's like, you know,
Yeah.
potential here because so much of it, even though like we may be looking at like the past that's showing up in the present, everyone's really in their core like looking to the future, like a moment when this is gone, when this is relief, the block.
Right.
So, right. And so it just gives you that hope. But the tools sometimes can be, sometimes the tools are, meditation. Sometimes it is, a more straightforward thing. And sometimes it is working with a professional who's going to guide you and can like deal with like the fact that the roots of that are complicated and they can be very tender. And, I never want anyone to feel like re-traumatized. So like often I'm like, when I'm like touching something and it can feel really tender, I'm like, okay, this feels really tender to me, so I'm gonna go to. And oftentimes people will be, just lay it on me. I'm like, no, 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 no. I'm not gonna just lay it on you unless I feel that it's like okay to like
To
let's just
lay
go
it on
right to the
you, right? Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So that's good. I think it's helpful for people to think about, do I need a psychic or do I need therapy? And
I recommend both.
I do recommend, absolutely.
I
Just
recommend both. Thank you, Patrick.
thank you, Heather. It's been fabulous talking with you. Fabulous
See
talking
you.
with you. And I will share with everyone where they can find you.
Okay.
HeatherCarlucci.com.
Yes.
Go see Heather for fabulous psychic or medical reading or
Or
both.
medical readings.
Or
And
both.
then I do the horoscopes. I channel horoscopes once
That's
a week on
right. On
Instagram. Heather
Instagram.
Carlucci Medium. Yes.
Right. That's right. So find out what's going on with your horoscopes.